You call this an offer? Her voice, a low hum of controlled fury, vibrated against the plush leather of his Bentley. Damian Blackwood, the man who'd crushed her family, merely smirked. He thought he held all the cards. Arrogant bastard. He saw her as a broken thing, useful for a single task. A translator. He was so very wrong. He had no idea Claire understood the nuances of power far better than he did, that her quiet, almost invisible hands held the threads of his empire. Justice was a dish best served cold and in perfect French. But compassion? That was the ingredient he didn't see coming, and it would be his undoing. They're about to find out. He dismissed her, waved her away, never once gracing her with eye contact. But he made one catastrophic miscalculation. He assumed that because she was sworn, she had nothing to say. He was about to learn that some of the most powerful voices are forged in the quietest fires. The weight of the silver tray was a familiar burden on Claire Sullivan's palm. It was a solid, tangible thing in a life that had become distressingly ephemeral. Here, within the velvet-draped, crystal-adorned walls of Ethelgard's, she was a ghost in a crisp black uniform, a silent cog in a machine designed to cater to the whims of men and women who would never know her name. Tonight, her ghost was serving Table 12, a prime corner booth occupied by the human equivalent of a thundercloud, Damian Blackwood. She knew the name, of course. Everyone in New York who followed the relentless pulse of finance knew it. Blackwood Capital was less a firm and more a force of nature, a corporate hurricane that swept through the market, leaving behind a trail of dismantled companies and newly minted billionaires. Damian Blackwood was its cold, calculating eye. His face, which she had only ever seen on the glossy pages of business magazines, was even harsher in person. Sharp angles, eyes the color of a winter sky, and a mouth that seemed permanently set in a line of impatient disapproval. From the moment he sat down, he radiated an aura of profound indifference. He did not look at her. When he ordered the restaurant's most expensive bottle of scotch, a single malt aged for 50 years that cost more than her monthly rent, he simply pointed a manicured finger at the menu, his gaze fixed somewhere over her left shoulder. Still water, no ice. He'd clipped his voice a low baritone that cut through the restaurant's hushed symphony of quiet conversation and distant piano music. Claire had learned the art of self-acement. It was a survival skill in this ecosystem. She made herself smaller, her movements economical, her voice a soft murmur. Of course, sir, she existed only as a pair of hands. Hands that poured the water without a single splash. Hands that presented the scotch for his curt, dismissive nod. Hands that placed the leather-bound menu before him. He never looked up. He was scrolling through something on his phone, his thumb moving with a predatory swiftness. For 10 minutes he sat in absolute silence. The scotch untouched the menu, unopened a black hole of energy in the opulent room. Her station was a small alcove near the kitchen doors where she could observe without being observed. Her friend and fellow waitress Sophie sidled up to her, wiping a stray drop of wine from a polished glass. Table 12 is in a mood tonight, Sophie whispered, her eyes flicking towards Blackwood. Marcus is sweating bullets. Apparently his guest is Julien Dubois, the French tech mogul. Big deal. Claire's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Julien Dubois. Her father used to speak of him, calling him a true innovator, one of the few visionaries in a field of imitators. Her father. The thought was a familiar, painful tightening in her chest. She pushed it down back into the locked box where she kept all the memories of the life she once had, the life before Blackwood. She didn't know for a fact that Damian Blackwood himself was the man who had signed the final papers, the one whose pen stroke had shattered Sullivan Holdings, and with it her family. But she knew his company was the one. Blackwood Capital had orchestrated the hostile takeover with a surgical, brutal efficiency that the papers had called a masterclass in corporate raiding. They hadn't written about the aftermath, her father's broken spirit, the sale of their home, the trust funds that evaporated overnight, and her trading a degree in art history and linguistics from Columbia for an apron and a notepad. Serving him now felt like a cruel joke penned by the universe. He was the architect of her ruin, and he didn't even have the decency to see her. To him, she was just part of the furniture. The irony was so thick she could taste it more bitter than the dregs of cheap coffee she drank before her shifts. "Claire, you okay?" Sophie asked, her brow furrowed with concern. Claire forced a small, tight smile. "Just tired. It's been a long week." The lie was smooth from practice. No one here knew she was Claire Sullivan, daughter of the late Robert Sullivan. Here she was, just Claire, the quiet, efficient waitress who was surprisingly good at her job. The one who never complained, who took the worst tables, and who spoke 4 languages fluently, a skill she kept carefully hidden, a relic from a past that no longer belonged to her. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb outside, visible through the restaurant's towering arched windows. A man in a tailored charcoal suit emerged, his silver hair catching the light. He was greeted at the door by Marcus the Maitreya, whose usual stiff formality was amplified into a near-frantic display of deference. Julien Dubois had arrived. Marcus led him to table 12. Blackwood finally looked up from his phone, his expression not shifting from its default state of cool impatience. The 2 men shook hands, a brief perfunctory gesture. Dubois was smaller than Blackwood, older, with a kind face that seemed out of place next to Blackwood's granite profile. He carried an air of old-world European elegance that contrasted sharply with Blackwood's raw American power. Claire took a deep, steadying breath, smoothing her apron. It was time. She picked up her notepad, her face a carefully constructed mask of professional neutrality, and walked toward the table, towards the man who held her past in his ledger books, and the man her father had once admired. "Good evening, gentlemen. May I take your order, or would you prefer to start with an imperative?" she asked, her voice calm and even. Dubois offered her a polite smile. Blackwood didn't even flinch. He just stared at his guest as if Claire were a disembodied voice in the room. "We will order now," Blackwood stated, his gaze still locked on Dubois. He didn't ask his guest what he wanted. He simply began to dictate. "He'll have the seared scallops to start, then the fillet mignon, medium rare. I'll have the steak tartare and bring another bottle of the scotch." He waved a hand in her direction, a gesture of dismissal. "That will be all." Claire held her ground for a half-second longer than necessary, a tiny silent act of rebellion. She met the cold, unseeing gaze he was directing past her, and held it even though he wasn't looking at her. He wouldn't remember her face, but she would never forget his. "Very good, sir," she said, her voice betraying none of the acid churning in her stomach. She turned and walked away, the weight of the silver tray, now feeling like the weight of her entire fallen world. The ghost of Ethelgard's had a name and a memory, and tonight she had a feeling that something was about to change. The kitchen at Ethelgard's was a world away from the serene opulence of the dining room. It was a chaotic ballet of heat, steam, and shouted commands. Flames leaped from pans, and the air was thick with a dozen competing aromas. For Claire, it was a sanctuary of sorts. Here the pressure was immediate and physical, a welcome distraction from the psychological warfare she waged against her own memories out on the floor. She relayed the order for table 12 to the head chef, Jean-Luc, a temperamental genius who respected precision above all else. "Fillet for Dubois, medium rare. Tartare for Blackwood," she said, her voice steady. Jean-Luc grunted his acknowledgement, his focus already on the slab of prime beef he was butchering. As she waited for the appetizers, Claire organized her station with meticulous care, wiping down already clean surfaces, polishing silverware that already gleamed. It was a way to channel the nervous energy coiling in her gut. She could feel Damien Blackwood's presence like a drop in atmospheric pressure, a cold front that chilled the entire room. To him, this dinner was a transaction, a necessary step in the acquisition of whatever part of Julien Dubois' empire he was targeting. People to men like Blackwood were not partners. They were assets to be leveraged or liabilities to be cut. She knew that better than anyone. When the scallops seared to a perfect golden brown were ready, she carried them to the table. Blackwood and Dubois were speaking in low, serious tones. Dubois was gesturing with his hands, his English accented but clear. Blackwood was leaning back, his expression unreadable, listening with an unnerving stillness. Claire placed the plates down with practiced grace. "Your seared scallops, Mr. Dubois, and the steak tartare, Mr. Blackwood." Dubois looked up and gave her a brief, appreciative nod. Blackwood ignored her completely. His focus was absolute. He picked up his fork and took a bite of the raw, seasoned beef, chewing with a methodical intensity, as if analyzing a balance sheet. The conversation at the table grew more animated as the meal progressed. Claire moved in and out of their orbit, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, a silent phantom in their periphery. She caught snippets of their talk discussions of server architecture, market penetration, proprietary algorithms. It was clear that Dubois was passionate about the technical and creative aspects of his company, while Blackwood was interested solely in the numbers, the potential for growth, and the efficiency of the operation. The main courses were served. The fillet was cooked to perfection. The tartare was seasoned impeccably, yet the tension at the table was palpable. Dubois was becoming frustrated. He was trying to explain a nuanced, complex concept, a core piece of his company's innovative technology that he clearly felt was being undervalued. "You see, Mr. Blackwood," Dubois said, leaning forward, his fork forgotten on his plate. "It is not simply a matter of scaling the user base. The elegance of the design is in its predictive capacity. It is an art. It anticipates the user's need before the user is even aware of it. To describe it in terms of mere data points is to describe a cathedral in terms of its bricks." Blackwood took a slow sip of his scotch. "Art doesn't have a quarterly earnings report, Mr. Dubois. Your sentiment is admirable, but my investors are not patrons of the arts. They are interested in returns. The elegance, as you call it, is a feature, not the foundation. I need to understand the scalability of the foundation." Dubois threw his hands up in a gesture of exasperation. He was searching for the right words in English, his brow furrowed in concentration. He started a sentence, stopped, and then shook his head, a frustrated sigh escaping his lips. He switched to his native French, the words tumbling out in a rapid, passionate flood, a stream of technical and philosophical arguments that were clearly the heart of his position. He spoke for a full minute, his voice filled with the frustration of a creator trying to explain his soul to an accountant. Damien Blackwood's face remained a stony mask, but a flicker of annoyance crossed his features. He didn't understand a word. He held up a hand. "Mr. Dubois, Julian," he said, his voice laced with an icy patience. "I have no idea what you just said. We conduct business in English." "Forgive me," Dubois said, looking flustered. "It is just that the specific terminology, the nuance, it does not translate well. The very concept is French in its philosophy." "Then I suggest you find a way to translate it," Blackwood said coldly. The deal, which had been simmering, was now in danger of freezing over completely. The air between them crackled with misunderstanding. Claire was standing nearby, holding a silver water pitcher, preparing to refill their glasses. She had been listening, and she had understood every single word Dubois had said. His argument was not just passionate, it was brilliant. He was describing a form of artificial intelligence that was almost symbiotic, an elegant dance between code and human intuition. To dismiss it as bricks was an act of profound ignorance. Something inside her snapped. It wasn't a conscious decision. Not really. It was an impulse born of years of suppressed intelligence, of watching her father's passion being bulldozed by men who only understood profit and loss. It was the linguist in her, offended by the butchering of a beautiful concept. It was the daughter in her seeing another innovator being misunderstood by a corporate predator. She stepped forward. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her voice, when it came out, was as clear and cool as a mountain spring. She looked directly at Julien Dubois. She began to speak in French. The words flowed out of her effortlessly, a language she had loved since she was a child. It was the precise academic French she'd perfected at Columbia, not the casual French of a tourist. She wasn't just translating, she was interpreting. "Mercure Dubois," she began, her tone respectful but firm. "If I may be so bold, what you are describing is not merely a predictive algorithm, but a form of synthetic intuition. You are arguing that the value is not in the data it collects, but in its emergent ability to understand context, culture, and unspoken human desire. It is not a bigger net for catching fish. It is a current that guides the fish where they wish to go, creating a marketplace of intent rather than reaction. She continued flawlessly translating the essence of Dubois' passionate outburst into the cold corporate language that Blackwood would understand. She used analogies he would grasp, comparing the code's elegance to the structural integrity of a skyscraper, its predictive power to a high-frequency trading algorithm. She took Dubois' art and framed it as undeniable revolutionary commerce. The entire restaurant seemed to fall silent around their table. Julien Dubois was staring at her, his mouth slightly agape, his eyes wide with astonishment and dawning comprehension. He nodded slowly, then more vigorously. "We said exactua. Yes, that is it precisely." But Claire wasn't looking at Dubois anymore. Her gaze had shifted for the first time all evening to meet the eyes of Damien Blackwood, and for the first time he was seeing her. The mask of indifference was gone, shattered. His face was a canvas of raw shock. His gray eyes, which had looked through her, past her, and around her all night, were now locked onto her with a searing laser-like intensity. It was as if she had suddenly materialized out of thin air, a fully formed person who had been standing there all along, whom he had simply been too arrogant to perceive. The silence stretched thick and heavy. In that moment, she was no longer a ghost. She was a voice, and Damien Blackwood, for the first time in a long time, was utterly, completely speechless. The spell was broken by Julien Dubois, letting out a low, appreciative whistle. He looked from Claire to Damien and back again, a wide, genuine smile spreading across his face. "Incredible, Dubois," said his English returning now, infused with a renewed energy. "Young lady, you have not just translated my words. You have understood my soul. You have a gift." He turned to Damien, his eyes twinkling. "This woman, she understands my work better than my own board of directors. Blackwood, you asked me to find a way to translate. It seems you had one here all along." Damien said nothing. His gaze remained fixed on Claire, a storm of emotions swirling in their depths. Shock, confusion, and something else. A glint of sharp analytical curiosity. The look he gave her was the same one he might give a company whose stock had inexplicably quadrupled overnight. He was reassessing, recalculating. Claire felt a strange, heady sense of power. The fear that had been a knot in her stomach was gone, replaced by a cold, thrilling calm. She had thrown a grenade into his perfectly ordered world, and she was not going to flinch from the explosion. She simply held his gaze, her expression meticulously neutral, her posture still that of a humble waitress. "My apologies for the interruption, gentlemen," she said, her voice a model of professional decorum. "Would you care for some coffee or dessert?" The mundane question, so at odds with the charged atmosphere, seemed to stun Damien even further. It was a clear signal. "I know what I did, and I am not intimidated by you," Dubois chuckled warmly. "Coffee? Yes, for both of us. And bring whatever dessert your chef recommends. We are celebrating a new understanding." He beamed at Claire. "And please tell your manager that the service tonight has been without question the finest I have ever received anywhere." "Thank you, sir." "It is my pleasure," Claire replied, turning her attention solely to Dubois, a subtle but deliberate exclusion of Damien. She walked away from the table, her back straight, every step measured. She could feel Damien Blackwood's eyes on her, a physical pressure against her spine. She didn't look back. In the kitchen, she placed the dessert order, her hands perfectly steady. Sophie rushed over her face, a mixture of awe and terror. "Claire, what was that?" "Marcus is having a heart attack. You spoke French to table 12. "He was having trouble communicating," Claire said simply, retrieving 2 clean coffee cups. "You didn't just speak French. You sounded like you were negotiating a treaty." I saw Blackwood's face. I've never seen him look like that. It was like he'd seen a ghost. He has, Claire thought, the ghost of the girl whose life he wrecked. When she returned with the coffee and a decadent chocolate lava cake, the mood at the table had shifted entirely. The deal was back on. Dubois was animated, sketching ideas on a napkin, and Damien was listening intently, interjecting with sharp, insightful questions. The barrier of misunderstanding had been demolished, and Claire had been the wrecking ball. She served the dessert and refilled their coffee, moving with the same quiet efficiency as before. But everything was different. Damien's awareness of her was a constant humming current. His eyes would flick to her whenever she approached, He was watching her movements, the way she poured the coffee, the way she held the tray. He was studying her. Finally, the meal concluded. The bill, an astronomical figure, was settled with a black credit card that Damien produced without even looking at the total. Julien Dubois stood, and in a gesture that shocked the entire staff, he approached Claire directly. "Madame Wiesel," he said, taking her hand gently. "I do not know your name." "It's Claire, sir." "Claire, thank you. You did more than serve a meal tonight. You built a bridge." He released her hand and turned to Damien. "I will be in touch tomorrow, Blackwood. We have much to discuss." With a final nod to Claire, he was escorted out by a still flustered Marcus, and then they were alone. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away. It was just Claire standing by the now empty table, and Damien Blackwood, who had risen to his feet and was watching her with an unnerving stillness. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was low, stripped of its earlier arrogance, replaced by a raw, demanding curiosity. "I'm your waitress, sir," she replied, her tone level. "Don't play games with me," he said, taking a step closer. He was tall, and she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes. "That wasn't a waitress speaking at my table. That was a translator, a negotiator. That was a high-level corporate briefing delivered in perfect French. Where did you learn to speak like that?" "I studied linguistics," she said, offering a piece of the truth, but not the whole of it. "Linguistics," he repeated as if tasting the word. At some community college, the condescension was back a familiar weapon. "Columbia University," she replied, and had the deep satisfaction of watching another flicker of surprise cross his face. He was silent for a long moment, processing. His mind was clearly working at lightning speed, piecing together the puzzle she presented. A waitress at Ethelgard's, a Columbia education, fluent business-level French. The pieces didn't fit the neat boxes he sorted the world into. "You saved my deal tonight," he stated. It wasn't a compliment, it was a fact, an assessment. Dubois was about to walk. His technology is revolutionary, but he's an artist, not a salesman. "You sold him to me. I merely clarified his position, sir." "You did more than that." He counted, his eyes narrowing. "You understood the strategic value of his argument and reframed it for my context. That's not linguistics. That's business." He paused, his gaze intense. "I'm closing this deal in Paris next week. My usual translator is unavailable. I want you to come with me." Claire's breath caught in her throat. Paris working for him, the man who represented everything she had lost. It was a monstrous, unthinkable proposition. "I have a job, Mr. Blackwood." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "This," he said, gesturing around the opulent dining room, "this isn't a job. It's a stopgap. I'll pay you 10 times what you make here in a month for 1 week of your time. I'll cover all expenses. First-class travel, 5-star hotel. You will be my personal interpreter for the duration of the negotiations." The offer was staggering. It was more money than she had seen in years. It was a lifeline, but it was a lifeline thrown by the very man who had pushed her overboard. The irony was suffocating. "Why should I help you?" she asked, her voice quiet, but laced with steel. His expression hardened. He wasn't used to being questioned. "Because it's the most interesting offer you're going to get this year, because you're clearly wasting your talents here, and because I don't take no for an answer." He pulled a slim black business card from his wallet and placed it on the table. "My assistant Maria will call you in the morning with the details. Have your passport ready." He didn't wait for her answer. He turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving a trail of stunned silence in his wake. Claire looked down at the crisp black card on the white tablecloth. Damien Blackwood, CEO, Blackwood Capital. It felt less like an offer and more like a summons. Her heart was a battleground of conflicting emotions, revulsion, fear, and a terrifying, undeniable flicker of intrigue. To work for her enemy, to enter the lion's den, it was madness. But it was also an opportunity to get closer, to understand the man behind the machine of her family's destruction. And perhaps, just perhaps, an opportunity to find a justice of her own. The Gulfstream G650 cut through the clouds like a silver dart, its twin engines a distant, reassuring hum. Claire sat in a plush, cream leather seat that was larger and more comfortable than the armchair in her tiny studio apartment. A uniformed flight attendant had just served her a glass of champagne she hadn't asked for, and a plate of exquisite Aururva sat untouched on the polished mahogany table beside her. Across from her, separated by that same table, sat Damian Blackwood. He hadn't spoken more than 100 words to her since she'd been picked up by a black town car that morning. He'd simply nodded when she boarded the jet and gestured to her seat before immersing himself in a thick binder filled with financial reports. The silence was a palpable entity, a third passenger on the flight to Paris. Accepting his offer had been the most difficult decision of her life. It felt like a betrayal of her father's memory, a concession to the man who had broken him. But as she lay awake the night before, staring at the ceiling of her cramped apartment, a different thought had taken root. Refusing would change nothing. She would still be a waitress, and he would still be a billionaire. But accepting would put her inside the fortress. It would give her a vantage point, a chance to see the enemy up close. Knowledge her father had always told her was the only true power, so she had said yes. And in less than 24 hours, her life had been upended. Her threadbare waitress uniform was replaced by a chic, understated business wardrobe purchased for her by Damien's assistant in a whirlwind 2-hour shopping trip. Her tiny apartment was swapped for this flying palace. It was disorienting, a surreal plunge back into a world of privilege she thought she had lost forever. But this time she was not a participant. She was staff. It was a gilded co, and she was acutely aware of the bars. Damien finally closed the binder with a soft thud. He steepled his fingers and looked at her, his gray eyes analytical, devoid of any warmth. "We need to establish the ground rules," he said, his tone crisp and impersonal. "In Paris, you are not Claire the waitress. You are my communications consultant. You will be present in all meetings with Dubois and his team. You will speak only when I ask you to or when a direct translation is required. Your function is to facilitate communication, not to offer opinions." "I understand," she said, her voice even. "Good. You will be given a full brief on Dubois' company, our valuation, and our strategic objectives. I expect you to have it memorized by the time we land. I don't want you just translating words. I want you to understand the intent behind them." He pushed a sleek tablet across the table. "Everything you need is on there, encrypted." For the next 6 hours, Claire immersed herself in the data. It was complex, dense, and utterly fascinating. Blackwood Capital's analysis of Dubois' company was ruthless in its precision. They had dissected every aspect of the business, identifying strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities with a cold surgical clarity. Reading it, she began to understand how they had been able to dismantle her father's company. Sullivan Holdings had been built on relationships, on handshakes, and decades of trust. Blackwood Capital operated on data on algorithms that predicted market shifts and human weakness with terrifying accuracy. They didn't just outmaneuver their opponents, they rendered their entire philosophy of business obsolete. As she read, she found herself becoming engrossed her linguist brain, enjoying the challenge of this new complex language of finance. She made notes, cross-referenced figures, and began to see the narrative hidden within the numbers. She saw the story of a brilliant company on the verge of either greatness or collapse, and the larger story of how power worked in the 21st century. Damien watched her for a long time, his own work forgotten. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the quick, intelligent flicker of her eyes as she absorbed the information, the way she unconsciously bit her lower lip when she stumbled upon a particularly complex projection. He was seeing the scholar from Columbia, the intellect that had been hidden beneath a waitress's apron. He had hired a tool, a simple translator. He was beginning to suspect he had acquired something far more complex and potentially far more dangerous. They arrived in Paris as the sun was setting, the city lights twinkling below them like a carpet of scattered diamonds. A car was waiting on the tarmac. They were whisked through the city to the Hotel Gorbar, a palace of breathtaking luxury. Claire was shown to a suite that was larger than her entire apartment building floor. It had a marble bathroom, a walk-in closet, and a balcony with a view of the Eiffel Tower. It was designed to impress, to overwhelm, to make her feel indebted, and it worked a little. But as she stood on the balcony, Feeling the cool Parisian air on her face, she felt a surge of defiance. He could give her luxury, but he couldn't buy her soul. This was all temporary. This was a means to an end. The next morning, the negotiations began. They took place in a stark modern boardroom in Dubois' headquarters, a glass and steel building that was a temple to minimalist design. The French team was formidable, sharp, impeccably dressed, and fiercely protective of their company. From the start, it was clear why Damien needed her. The French executives often lapsed into their native tongue to discuss nuanced points among themselves. In previous negotiations, this would have been a wall for Damien. Now it was a window. Claire sat silently beside him, a pen and notepad in her hand. When the French team spoke, she would provide a quiet, simultaneous translation for Damien, her voice, a low, unobtrusive murmur in his ear. She didn't just translate their words. She translated their tone, their hesitations, the subtle shifts in their alliances. The CTO is concerned about integration, she'd whisper. The CFO is bluffing. Their cash flow is tighter than they're letting on. Damien absorbed her input without comment, his face an unreadable mask, but she could see him adjusting his strategy in real time based on her intelligence. He would soften his approach when she indicated they were hitting a point of cultural pride and press his advantage when she signaled a point of financial weakness. They were a strange, ruthlessly effective team. He was the hammer, and she was the precision guidance system directing the blows for maximum impact. On the third day, they hit a major impasse. It concerned the future of Dubois' research and development division, the creative heart of the company. Damien wanted to streamline it, absorb it into Blackwood's larger R&D structure, a move that would undoubtedly lead to layoffs and a loss of autonomy. Dubois was incensed. The argument grew heated, voices were raised, and the deal once again hung by a thread. Dubois in his anger unleashed a torrent of passionate French accusing Damien of being a barbarian who wanted to tear the soul out of his creation. Damien looked at Claire. Translate. This was a test. She could give him the literal inflammatory translation, which would likely cause him to walk away from the table, or she could do what she had done in the restaurant. She could build a bridge. She took a breath. Mr. Blackwood, she began, her voice calm and clear, addressing him, but speaking for the entire room to hear. Mr. Dubois is not questioning your business acumen. He is expressing a core fear that in the pursuit of efficiency, the very source of the company's innovation will be destroyed. He believes the R&D division is not a department, but an ecosystem. He is asking for reassurance that you are not just buying the fruit, but that you intend to preserve the tree that grows it. Her reframing of the argument hung in the air, instantly diffusing the tension. It validated Dubois' passion while translating it into a business problem that Damien could solve. It wasn't about sentiment, it was about asset preservation. Damien was silent for a moment, his eyes locked on hers. A flicker of something begrudging respect perhaps passed through them. He turned back to Dubois. I understand, Damien said slowly. Let's discuss a new structure. A semi-autonomous innovation lab funded by Blackwood Capital, but creatively directed by you. Let's preserve the tree. The crisis was averted. As the meeting broke for the day, Claire felt a dizzying mix of triumph and self-loathing. She had helped him. She had used her intellect, the very thing her father had nurtured in her, to serve the man who had destroyed him. The gilded cage had never felt more suffocating. She was becoming good at this, and that terrified her more than anything. That evening, Damien announced they would be having dinner with the Dubois team to celebrate the breakthrough in negotiations. It was not a request. Claire found a simple, elegant black dress laid out on her bed, another product of the efficient and all-knowing Maria. It fit perfectly. The dinner was at a Michelin-starred restaurant tucked away in a quiet Parisian arrondissement. The atmosphere was convivial, filled with the relief of a deal pulled back from the brink. Wine flowed and laughter echoed in the private dining room. Claire sat quietly observing a ghost at the feast. Damien was a different person in this setting. He could be charming when he chose to be engaging in witty banter with Dubois, discussing art and history with a surprising depth of knowledge. Claire watched him trying to reconcile this cultured man with the corporate predator she knew him to be. It was a disquing realization he wasn't a one-dimensional villain. He was complex, intelligent, and in some ways captivating, and that made him even more dangerous. Late in the evening, Julien Dubois raised his glass to her. "To Claire," he said, his voice warm, "the golden tongue who speaks the language of both poetry and profit. Without you, we would not be here tonight." Everyone at the table applauded. Claire felt a hot blush creep up her neck. She looked across the table and met Damien's eyes. He wasn't applauding. He was just watching her, his expression intense and unreadable. For a fleeting second, she saw something in his gaze that wasn't about business. It was personal. It was a look of profound, unsettling curiosity, as if he were trying to see right through her. The look unnerved her so much that she excused herself, murmuring something about needing some fresh air. She stepped out onto a small wrought iron balcony overlooking a moonlit courtyard. The cool night air was a relief. She leaned against the railing, her heart pounding. This was all becoming too complicated. The clear lines of animosity she had drawn were blurring. She was beginning to see the man, not just the monster. The door behind her opened and closed softly. She didn't have to turn to know it was him. His presence filled them, the small space. "You did well today," Damien said, his voice a low rumble beside her. He stood next to her at the railing, not looking at her, but out at the courtyard. "I was doing my job," she replied, her tone cool. "No," he said. "You did more than that. You found a third way. I've never had an interpreter do that before." He turned to face her. "You have a name I've never heard before. Sullivan. Claire Sullivan. Is it an Irish name?" The sound of her own name, her real name from his lips, sent a jolt through her. It was a name he should have known, a name that should have been on the list of companies he'd acquired on the documents that had shattered her world. But to him, it was just a name, a casual inquiry. "My family has roots in Ireland." "Yes," she said, her voice tight. "Sullivan," he mused, testing the sound of it. "There was a Sullivan Holdings, a logistics company. We acquired it a few years back. Any relation?" Her blood ran cold. The moment had arrived out of nowhere on a moonlit balcony in Paris. Her carefully constructed facade was about us all to crumble. This was her chance. She could tell him everything. She could unleash the years of pain and anger. She could watch his face as he realized who he had been working with, who he had brought into his inner sanctum. She opened her mouth to speak the words, "Robert Sullivan was my father," balanced on the tip of her tongue, but she stopped. What would it accomplish? A moment of dramatic satisfaction? It would get her fired, sent back to New York on the next flight. Her access would be gone. The opportunity to learn more, to understand why, would vanish. It was too soon. It was strategically unsound. The cold, calculating part of her brain, the part that had been learning from him all week, took over. She forced a small, dismissive laugh. "I wish if I were related to them, I doubt I'd have been serving you scotch last week." The lie was smooth, believable. She watched his face for any sign of suspicion, but there was none. He accepted it at face value. Why wouldn't he? The daughter of the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company would never be a waitress. "It was unthinkable, right?" he said, turning his gaze back to the courtyard. The moment passed. The opportunity was gone. Relief and self-loathing warred within her. She had been a coward. No, she had been strategic. She had preserved her position. The justification felt hollow. "You're a puzzle." "Claire Sullivan," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You don't fit. Columbia-educated linguist, brilliant strategic mind working for tips at Ethelgard's. It doesn't add up. Sometimes life doesn't go according to plan." She said the words tasting like ash. "I had family issues, financial setbacks, another half-truth." He seemed to accept this, nodding slowly. The world is full of people who complain about their setbacks. It's rare to find someone who just gets on with it. "I respect that." The compliment was like a slap in the face. Respect from him was the last thing she wanted. Or was it? The confusion was maddening. They stood in silence for a few more minutes, a strange, unspoken truce between them. Claire felt a powerful urge to get away, to be alone, to rebuild the walls he was slowly, unconsciously dismantling. I should get back inside, she said. As she turned to leave, he spoke again, his voice stopping her. When we get back to New York, the job is yours if you want it. Permanent position, head of my communications department. You'd report directly to me. The offer was a thunderclap. It wasn't just a week in Paris anymore. It was a career, a future, a permanent place in the heart of the Emma. She despised a golden key to her gilded cage. I'll have to think about it. She managed to say, her mind reeling. She walked back into the warmth and laughter of the party, but she felt colder than ever. Damian Blackwood hadn't just offered her a job. He was offering her a chance to become one of them. And the most terrifying part was, for a split second, she had been tempted to accept. Back in her suite that night, sleep was impossible. His casual mention of Sullivan Holdings replayed in her mind. He didn't remember it with any significance. It was just another transaction. But for her, it was everything. Driven by a new fierce urgency, she opened the encrypted tablet he had given her. It contained the Dubois deal files, but she wondered what else she could access. She was logged into the Blackwood Capital network. With trembling fingers, she navigated to the internal search function. She typed in Sullivan Holdings. Her heart hammered as the search results populated. There were dozens of files, acquisition proposals, financial audits, transition plans. Most were locked, requiring higher security clearance, but one was not. It was a simple file of correspondence, a collection of internal emails from the time of the takeover. She opened it. The emails were mostly dry corporate jargon, but as she scrolled down, a name caught her eye. George Peterson. He had been her father's chief operating officer, a man her father had trusted like a brother. He had stayed on after the acquisition. She read an email from George to a senior VP at Blackwood Capital, dated 3 months before the takeover had even been announced. It contained an attachment, a detailed confidential report on Sullivan Holdings, internal vulnerabilities, its key client dependencies, and the precise psychological profile of her father, Robert Sullivan, noting his aversion to conflict and his loyalty to his senior staff. It was a betrayal, a stab in the back. Her father hadn't just been outmaneuvered in the market. He had been sold out from the inside. This wasn't just business, it was a conspiracy. George Peterson, the man who had delivered a tearful eulogy at her father's funeral, had been the mole. But who at Blackwood had he been corresponding with? She scanned the tow field of the email. It wasn't a VP. The email, with its devastating payload, had been sent directly to one person, Damian Blackwood. The screen blurred through the tears welling in her eyes. It was worse than she had ever imagined. Damian hadn't just been the indifferent CEO signing papers. He had been the puppet master, the one actively cultivating the betrayal that had broken her father and her family. He hadn't just conquered Sullivan Holdings, he had poisoned it from within. The last of her confusion and ambivalence evaporated, burned away by a white-hot rage. He had offered her a job, a future. He had looked at her with something approaching respect, and all along he had been carrying this venomous secret. The whispers of the past had become a roar, and now she knew her purpose. She would not just observe. She would not just survive. She would find justice, and she would use his own power, his own system against him. The flight back to New York was a masterclass in controlled fury. Claire accepted Damian's job offer with a calm, calculated yes, the words feeling like a declaration of war. The decision was no longer about temptation. It was about ammunition. She would enter the fortress not as a guest, but as a saboteur. Her first months at Blackwood Capital were a dizzying immersion into the enemy's world. She became Damian's shadow, sitting in on board meetings, drafting sensitive communications, and acting as his liaison for global clients. Her intellect, once applied to linguistics, proved devastatingly effective in corporate strategy. She learned his rhythms, anticipated his needs, and made herself indispensable. Damian, in turn, began to trust her. He granted her higher security clearance and started treating her less like an employee and more like a confidant, asking for her reads on competitors and partners. Each piece of trust she earned was both a victory and a poison. She was using the skills her father had nurtured to aid the man who had destroyed him. All the while she was digging. Late at night in the silent, empty office, she used her access to sift through digital archives. She found fragments of the conspiracy-damning emails between her father's COO, George Peterson, and Blackwood executives, encrypted payment records to Peterson's offshore account. She was building a case brick by painstaking brick. The final piece, the smoking gun, came from an unexpected source. While organizing files for a corporate retreat, she gained access to the physical archives. In a dusty box labeled Acquisition Preliminaries 2019, she found a single handwritten memo from Damien to his legal team. It was a list of pros and cons for the Sullivan Holdings takeover. Under the pros column, he had written two phrases that made her blood run cold: Peterson leverage, and right below it, CEO weakness, emotional attachment to staff. He hadn't just outmaneuvered her father, he had profiled him, identifying his goodness and loyalty as a vulnerability to be exploited. This wasn't business. It was a character assassination executed on a balance sheet. She photographed the memo, her hands shaking. This was everything. Her first instinct was to go to the press and ruin him. But public humiliation felt insufficient. Damien would survive a scandal. He would pay a fine issue, a non-apology, and move on. It was a destructive, impersonal act. She wanted something more. She wanted him to face the human cost of his leverage. She needed a direct confrontation. She scheduled a meeting the next day under the pretense of finalizing retreat details. He cleared his afternoon for her. Claire walked into his panoramic office and placed her tablet on his desk without sitting down. "I believe you should see this," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. She swiped and the image of his handwritten memo appeared. His smile vanished. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "From the archives," she said, swiping again to show the Petersonen emails, then again to the offshore payment records. With each swipe, the color drained further from his face. She saved the final piece for last. She swiped one more time, and a photograph filled the screen. A smiling, kinded man with his arm around a teenage girl. The girl was Claire. The man was her father. Damien stared at the picture, his gaze flickering from the smiling girl on the screen to the cold, composed woman before him. The pieces clicked into place with a shattering force. "Sullivan!" He breathed the name a ragged whisper. "Sullivan Holdings. Robert Sullivan was my father." Claire said each word a final damning truth. "You identified his loyalty as a weakness to be exploited. You didn't just acquire his company, Mr. Blackwood. You destroyed a good man. His mask of command and control didn't just slip. It disintegrated, revealing the man beneath, finally forced to see the ghost he had created." The silence in the office was absolute. Damien sank into his chair. The color drained from his face as he stared at the photo of Claire and her father. I didn't know," he stammered. "What do you want?" "Money. Name your price." Claire laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You think this is about money? My father built a community, and you saw it as an asset to be stripped. Your brand of justice, scorched earth, isn't mine. Ruining you won't help the hundreds of employees who lost their jobs and pensions." Instead of leaking the story to the press, she slid a new proposal across his desk. It wasn't a demand for a settlement. It was a charter for the Sullivan Foundation, an entity to be funded with a $50 million endowment from Blackwood Capital. Its mission to support employees displaced by hostile takeovers, with her father's former staff being the first beneficiaries. It wasn't revenge, it was restitution. Damien read it stunned. This was a more profound punishment than any public scandal. A permanent monument to his actions, funded by his own fortune. "All right," he said, his voice. "I'll do it." As Claire turned to leave, he called after her. "Wait, will you stay?" She paused at the door, her expression unreadable. "My work here isn't finished, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice firm. "We have a foundation to build." Claire's journey began in the shadows of a world that refused to see her, but she refused to remain invisible. Her story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet, observant voice that speaks a language no one expects. She proved that you don't need an army to topple an empire. You just need intelligence, courage, and an unbreakable will to fight for what's right. She didn't just seek revenge. She demanded restitution, transforming her pain into a legacy of hope for others. If Claire's story of resilience and unexpected justice moved you, please give this video a like to show your support. Share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own hidden power. Most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories that uncover the extraordinary and the ordinary. What would you have done in her place? Let us know in the comments below.